Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, live in studio today with philosopher Jason Rheins.
Hi.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Please hit that like button, super chat your thoughts and questions especially, and hit that join button to become a member of the channel. We're going to be talking about Charles Darwin, evolution, natural selection. How does this all relate to philosophy and objectivism in particular, of course? We got a lot to talk about today, and let's get started. So I guess if we can, I know we got a lot to get into. Can we start with sort of the current way people look at evolution in one respect? Because I know when I was growing up in the 90s, religious people, it was still controversial for them to even acknowledge that evolution was true. Whereas today, in such a short amount of time, not only have many of them, most of them accepted evolution from what I picked up, but they actually use it to justify religion. Now I'm hearing religious people say, religion is evolutionarily beneficial, and it's actually the fact that religious stories stuck with us for so long basically suggests that they're implanted in us through evolution. Does this raise any thoughts from you before we get to Darwin and all that?
Yeah. So, I mean, there have been, in the time since you were a kid and now, there have been some, at least in the United States, legal battles, court cases that have further hampered the efforts of conservatives to get the theory of creationism put into secular or public schools alongside the theory of evolution, but like the Dover, Pennsylvania case. But in general, I would say that for biblical literalists, it's still the theory of evolution still is a non-starter. They can't sanction it at all, since it refutes the kind of picture of creation in the Bible. And the idea of using a kind of meme theory of social evolution to kind of justify religion, I suppose that's been done or tried in various ways in various theories. And it's not totally surprising that someone would try to do that, someone who's trying to give religion more of a scientific gloss or glaze, but I think ultimately it's kind of bogus. So we can talk about that, but definitely why does the theory of evolution kind of come up against and become controversial for Western religion in a way that so many other scientific theories don't? I mean, I think that's worth discussing.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's start with at the beginning, and I'm going to be holding my phone to see your super chats and stuff like that. Sylvia has become a member of the channel. Welcome. And everybody else, hit that join button to join Sylvia. So it's not like I'm just, texting and checking my phone, just FYI. I'm going to be reading your super chats. What is the theory of evolution by natural selection?
Okay. So the theory of evolution by natural and sexual selection, it's two mechanisms, is Darwin's account of how species evolve over time, and in particular, explaining how and why it appears that the various species we find across the world seem in some ways adapted to their environment in all kinds of extremely complex ways. So the first question is, is this did Darwin invent the theory of evolution? And if by that you mean that the living things that are on Earth now are not necessarily the living things that were on Earth in the past, then no. Theories that the kinds of living things that are on Earth have changed over time have been around since the ancient Greeks. And Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, even wrote a kind of atomist Empedoclean sort of poem about the changes of living forms. But what people hadn't figured out was how such an evolution would work. And in particular, if the way that animals and plants and other living things changed over time was a random process, they couldn't account for how it produced living beings that had such complex functional structures. So we have teeth in the front for cutting and teeth in the back for grinding and ones in the middle for tearing, and all of that seems to work. And various species live in tightly knit symbiosis with one another. And if they were any different, it couldn't work. How does that just happen if things are changing at random? And the answer is, well, it's not at random. Okay, well, if it's not at random, is it because there's a brilliant designer who like some clockmaker has designed all these moving gears and parts to fit together perfectly? No. And hence so here I'll mention the kind of metaphor that Dawkins uses in his book. It's an excellent book, Introducing Evolutionary Theory, the blind watchmaker. You have this process that produces things that are extremely complex and highly functional, yet does so without any overseeing consciousness, without anybody designing it. So it's a process that produces functionality and complexity without itself being conscious. And that's what Darwin offered. And the specific mechanisms that he said, well, this is how it happens, is natural selection, and then he added sexual selection. So what's that? The last thing I'll explain. Well, Darwin begins in The Origin of Species by making an analogy to artificial selection. So he says, look, animal breeders have known for a long time in the domestication of animals in general, and then just our pets, like we select certain features. We say, okay, this one has longer hair. We're going to breed it with another one with longer hair. And over time we get, ones that have longer hair and fewer of the ones that have short hair, right? So we're picking and choosing the winners and losers of which ones are going to reproduce and going to have children, and they reproduce and so on. And he says, okay, well, we can do that artificially, but nature can do that too. And the most powerful way that nature does this is by not deciding in a conscious way, but by being present to which living creatures live and die. So the kind of if you wanted a formula for like what ingredients do you need to get something like natural selection, the answer is heritable traits with variation in a population and which make a difference to survival. So what you do is you take a given population of a species, okay? They're not identical to one another. There are various differences. These differences can be passed down, and these differences make a difference to which ones live or die, who gets eaten, who gets spotted by the predator, who can spot the prey, and who gets selected as a mate, who gets the girl, so to speak, or the guy, and gets to reproduce. And if you have traits that you can pass down and that make a difference as against your neighbors about whether you live or die, whether you reproduce or not, then over time, you will get a kind of sorting of quote unquote, evolutionary winners and losers. And that means that certain traits will tend to fall out of a population, or at least become diminished in proportion. And over time, others will grow. And it's worth pointing out that in this theory of evolution, not all the theories of evolution that were being considered in the 19th century, but in this theory of evolution, Darwin's, it's species or populations that evolve, not individuals. So it's not like over time your energies transform you, and then that changes the body of your child, and then that changes their body, which is a Lamarckian theory. It's the population that changes. So that's the theory.
Mm-hmm. And so evolution is like a conceptualization of the change that we can observe in a species over many generations. It's not like this. It's a series of changes that happen over time, which results in what looks like one species morphing into another. But it's not like this change is happening on purpose. Do you kind of get what I'm trying to say?
It's not happening on purpose, but it's not totally random either. It is in response to specific factors, and it selects certain factors. Now, the theory of evolution by natural selection, that's who lives and who dies, and sexual selection, who gets to who reproduces and who doesn't. And Darwin certainly always treated these as two different mechanisms. Why? Because they can come in conflict. The peacock's tail, the male peacock's enormous tail, stinks for natural selection. It draws a lot of resources. It makes you easily perceivable by something that might want to eat you, but it's great for sexual selection, really attracts a mate. So there are trade-offs here, right? Okay, but these two factors, they are not the only sort of factors that determine where a species goes. Random mutation turns out to be an important factor, and what we call genetic drift is also a factor or an issue. Now, Darwin had not worked out a theory of genetics. It was Mendelian genetics, and then that was synthesized with Darwin's theory in what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the early 20th century by people like Haldane and others. And that was like the kind of grand, like that was the, if Darwin was gold, that, or, you know, it was an extra star, let's say, on the theory, but it was basically, it was ready for that, but it added something.
Mm-hmm. All right. So speaking of, well, it was not random, but it also wasn't done by God. And that's the kind of an ongoing dichotomy. People think either there's a designer or it's completely random with no cause and effect. But in fact, causality is what we do see in nature. It's things happen, again, not because God said so, but also not without cause. It happens with cause. So let's talk about what was happening in the world of philosophy, in the world of science. And I understand back then those words were somewhat interchangeable even. Maybe philosophy really just meant science for a long time. But what was happening in the 19th century, and how does Darwin sort of fit in there, if that's a question you can answer?
So the 19th century was a golden era. The late 18th, 19th century was a golden era for natural history. Just sort of learning what kind of living things were there all across the globe, what kind of geological formations was there, figuring out the age of the earth and things like that. And Darwin is part of this movement and scientific project of natural history. The 19th century is also a great era for the historical sciences and for the role and the increasing role of history in philosophy. So seeing things in terms of historical processes is sort of big. And in that connection, Darwin is incredibly influenced by the work of Lyell, the great kind of geologist. Lyell had suggested that the kinds of formations we see of valleys and peaks, of canyons and rivers and so on, that these were not the result of huge cataclysmic events where God just like put his hand down and made a dip, but that these are all the results of long, slow, gradual processes that are ongoing. And that had a big impact on Darwin's thinking. And Darwin thought, okay, like what if it's a process like that also is accounting for why the different kinds of life we find everywhere are the way they are. So that's where it is. Science in Darwin's time, science or philosophy still is a word that often means science, or at least natural philosophy means natural science. It's not. It's Whewell, a philosopher of science in the 19th century, who coins the term scientist to refer to what previously was called a natural philosopher. So these are closely related, and Darwin's process, the way by which he arrived at the theory of natural and sexual selection, evolution by those, has also been a kind of model for philosophers of science for thinking about how good science works. Darwin, in addition to being a great scientist, is really good at describing his own sort of methods of detailing the data he collects and how his thinking develops. And he gives us a really wonderful eye into the kind of process of creating theory.
Now, Whewell, would you say was impacted by like the German, like Immanuel Kant, or is that, yeah, go ahead.
Whewell's not my specialty. He certainly knew the German theories, but Whewell is also, broadly speaking, in the English empiricist tradition, and continues to kind of have a induction heavy kind of theory. And Darwin gives a nice example of a kind of the paradigmatic picture of a Whewell scientific progress, where the real way you validate the biggest scientific principles, and the theory of evolution by natural and sexual selection is such a theory, is through Conciliation. So you gather all this different data from all these different areas. Sometimes you might even think of them as different fields. And when you eventually can find something that both can integrate different findings in different areas and explain them all in a much more clear and economical way than you ever could before. So it covers more things than you thought possible and makes sense of them all together. That's really strong validation for the theory that would do that. So inference to the best explanation, where it's an amazingly good explanation, and not just a good explanation in one field, but in many different fields. So it seems like it couldn't just be an accident, but it can explain this and explain that. And the theory of natural selection is like that. It explains why we find species with features where we find them, and not in addition to, so biogeography, in addition to the adaptations we find, in addition to competition, in addition to features that are sexually advantageous, but not naturally advantageous, just a ton of things that, and in general, the theory of evolution in some ways is a kind of master integration for the whole science of biology and explaining why we find the kinds of things we find in the living world.
Mm-hmm. Could you clarify what is consilience versus induction? So
consilience is a scientific or inference sort of process, which Whewell thinks is key to certain major kinds of induction. So I'm not sure, again, Whewell isn't my specialty. I don't recall if he thinks that every induction involves consilience, but at any rate, really big ones do. So consilience is when several different sort of areas or streams all converge on the same discovery, or rather the same discovery explains and ties together several different streams. So it can kind of unite previously disparate fields, and it also can explain better those 2, 3, 4 different fields, those 10 different types of evidence better than any individual theory of the evidence could have individually. So you had a theory of A for these A things and a theory of B. None of those are great theories, but suddenly you get a theory of X that covers A and B and C and D, and it's that light bulb moment where, okay, it all makes sense.
Now, the theory of evolution has big implications for philosophy in general. Now, and this is bigger than just studying the natural world, basically trying to understand what is the universe, where did it come from, if anywhere, et cetera. You know, this type of stuff that philosophers through the ages have pondered and contemplated. So what are some of the ways that the theory of evolution affects philosophy?
Okay, great question. I think there are three, I can sort of 3 or 4 like big categories. Let's call the first one sort of like teleology and cosmology. And so this is all the ways that the theory of evolution affects how we think about what is adaptive functional design. And the first thing is it has enormous implications for thinking about how human beings did or didn't come to be, and other living creatures. So among the various traditional theories of or proofs of God or the gods that go all the way back to Plato is the argument from design. And the argument from design is basically this. We look at some part or parts of the natural world. They are particularly beautiful or complex or intelligible, or you pick whatever positive adjective you want. But it's the sort of thing that you say, you couldn't just have it random. And if you couldn't just have it at random without an enormous intelligence or enormous power or something like that, then the proper inference to suppose is that it is or is the result of this kind of intelligence or power. And anything that could do that would be what we would call a god. And in some ways, I think of the argument from design as the least bad or best of the various arguments from the existence of God that go back to antiquity, for the simple reason that it proceeds in a semi-reasonable way of sort of saying, look, I mean, here's this stuff that we need to account for in the theory of nature. That's true. It's really hard to account for that in terms of any non-providential or non-purposeful, non-intentional process that we know of. Isn't the most sensible way to make sense of this some kind of purposeful process? So another way to put it is, when we see something like a written out message that makes intelligible sense, we don't think letters just got scattered together at random. We think somebody who knows how to write and who knows the language wrote it. And you might say, when you see something as complex or more complex and functional as some writing in, say, the structure of a living body, wouldn't you think there's an author of that too? If not, what's the alternative? And so as far back as in Plato, you get sort of two alternatives. Either it's the gods or it's sort of random chaos, and that doesn't make sense. Aristotle proposes a kind of third alternative, that nature is teleological. Nature gives you function. It gives you complex structure that is repeatable, but it's not intentional. But Aristotle's picture is not evolutionary. It doesn't describe the world changing over time. For Aristotle, the species on Earth have always been here and always will be. They're just a given. So it's not great for that kind of thing, but at least it offers a new kind of the third alternative of teleology. But because he didn't really have a way of explaining it, of how it works, and because it's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around, it's those other two alternatives, chance or God, that always dominated. Okay, well, what does the theory of evolution do to these arguments? It smashes them apart, because the arguments only work if there's no better explanation for the human eye than God. Well, guess what? There is an explanation, and it's a better explanation than God, because the human eye has a blind spot. The octopus's eye does not. Why does the human eye have a blind spot? Well, it evolved in a certain way from previous things, and the next thing to happen would be an improvement over this, would be like this, and then it would be an improvement to go to that. But guess along the way, you get this blind spot where retinal ganglia go back out through the front and to the back. And God, if God was designing this from scratch, he would never do that. But a process that is, in a sense, blind but works with what you've got would produce that. So it basically kills the idea that a designer is the best explanation or the only explanation from this. And then it certainly shows that the accounts of creation by special creation, God made these and God made these, in the Bible can't possibly be correct, because it's just not what we see.
So I thought I was special, cosmopolitan. What's the word I'm looking for? Cosmological.
Yeah.
I thought I was, something special, but it turns out, I'm like us people, we're no different than other things. Right. So why would you want to go with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, in many ways, the theory of evolution changes what, Victorians, others sort of thought about the universe and man's place in it. So first of all, nature is not this friendly place. The Romantics have this picture of idyllic nature. And then Tennyson writes, nature red in tooth and claw, right? Like the basic way that biological nature operates is through a bloody process of starvation and competition. That's not so nice. But additionally, we're not special. We were not created on the last day, at the last hour of the last day of creation, on the sixth day. In the second story in Genesis, the Garden of Eden one, man is created before the other animals, but leave that aside. In neither case, last or first, are we special. We're one of many living creatures that came about through this process of other living creatures. Later, with further anthropology, we learned there were other hominids very much like us. It's not clear that we were superior to Neanderthals in so many ways. We won, or were they inbred with us? But, we're not special. We're not the pinnacle of creation. The world isn't here for us. We're just a part of it. And for some people, that certainly breaks a certain religious illusion, but some people see that and they despair. The universe is chaos, it's violence. We're just another kind of cog, or another little, not even a cog, just a piece in this empty, cold, godless universe. And it is an unteleological universe in the sense that there's no designer. We're not here for a reason. There's a reason we evolved the way we did, or reasons at each stage in our history, but that doesn't mean that there's no purpose. So some people take the idea that there isn't a God-given purpose to mean that there's no such thing as purpose. And I think that's not the right answer. The answer is we are unique as among the living creatures on Earth. We have reason. We have purposes which we can set for ourselves, and those are meaningful for us. No, they're not meaningful to people, to the creatures in this other galaxy. That doesn't matter to them, but it does matter to us, and we're us, so they still matter. So it doesn't mean the universe can't have purpose for the individual creatures. It just means we weren't created with a purpose.
Yeah, in my understanding, kind of the history of philosophy is full of these sort of dichotomy that says like either there's a God and things matter, quote, or there's no God and nothing matters. But like, why would God make something matter? That's just like if God says this is right and wrong and this is what meaning is in life, that's just God's opinion, right? Like, why is like what is this so special about God that adds meaning and commentary to existence? Ultimately, yeah, values are value to someone, to something for a particular purpose. And this is where philosophy, like explicit philosophy, the most fundamental of the sciences, I suppose, addresses these dichotomies and corrects them.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in general, kind of various religious theories, which tend overwhelmingly to be what, say, in objectivism is called intrinsicism or intrinsicist, they often tend to sort of postulate that God or gods, supply meaning to something. And once you get to the kind of stage where these God or gods supply meaning, supply truth to something, it seems pretty arbitrary. It doesn't really add some deeper kind of justification. In a sense, it says like, well, I'm just looking for an authority to give the stamp of approval. And if I have it, that's fine. What I mean is there's an analogy here to say what's called divine command theory. Divine command theory is the theory that what makes something right or wrong is that God says to do it or not to do it. And what people who advocate divine command theory say is that without divine command theory, there would be no morality. Did the camera just go?
No, I think we're still going. It's just
okay.
It's just the camera itself.
And they say, if God weren't the authority to decide this, it would make no sense. Well, first, leave aside whether that's true or not. But then secondly, why would God saying so just make it make sense, right? If God can tell you to kill your son on a mountain and suddenly it becomes good to murder your own son, then what's so special about God telling you that it actually provides grounds? Now, let alone that's not the only way you can get grounds for normativity, but it's hard to see why that gives grounds at all. So it is this sort of thing where they just want an authority figure, right? A consciousness to tell them what to think. Yeah.
So now that evolution has been introduced, with natural selection and sexual selection, it's been misused, misunderstood often. I kind of alluded to that early in the episode, talking about how some religious types of thinkers are using evolution today. But just generally speaking, since evolution became a widespread accepted theory, in the Darwinian version in particular, social Darwinism has come about, as well as sort of evolutionary psychology, which I understand has problems as well. Can you speak about those?
Yeah. So let's call this sort of broadly what you might call scientism. And what is scientism? So scientism is a kind of way of taking science or a summation of contemporary science, reading a certain philosophical picture into it, and then claiming with the authority of science that science has shown that this philosophy is correct. So it's sort of philosophy in, philosophy out. Another way of putting it is science, natural science itself does not solve many of these fundamental metaphysical or ethical questions, but you could think that it does, often by assuming tacitly those theories to begin with. And then you can present those philosophical theories as having the imprimatur of natural science. You can say the theory of quantum mechanics proves that there's no cause and effect. But that's not true, right? But you might think, well, physics is good and it's pretty reliable, maybe, and why couldn't it show something? All right, so how does this work in practice, the theory of evolution? Well, there was a really interesting study. I wish I could remember either the authors or the year. I saw the data presented years ago in a really excellent talk by the philosopher of science, Philip Kitcher. And it was just presenting what various respondents to this survey sort of thought were things, whether they thought it was implied or not by the theory of evolution. So like, if the theory of evolution is true, then does it mean there's no God? If the theory of evolution is true, does it mean that some races are better than others? If the theory of evolution is true, does it mean that there's no free will? And it's shocking to see how many people, whether they think evolution is true or not, think that it has these negative implications. One of the strange things is that, say, even people who are not religious conservatives, who do say they believe the theory of evolution, they also associate it with all kinds of, you might call it negative or sad or unfortunate kind of philosophical results, like no free will or some kind of basis of racism. And again, it's really important to point out that what the theory says about the world, natural world, and what it doesn't say about the natural world or human nature. So from the get-go, people have been taking this theory of natural and sexual selection and been putting it to bad sort of philosophical purpose. Social Darwinism, like of Herbert Spencer, is one obvious case where you think of different racial groups pretty much picked from a biological perspective arbitrarily, just by certain historical and aesthetic kind of accidents. You define these as the different races. You think of them in competition to one another. You try to set social policy in terms of promoting the population of these or not. And you end up trying to sterilize, Native Americans and poor Irishmen and things like that. It's quite insane. And at no point does the theory of evolution say that these so-called races are real things among humans, that they are in competition with one another in the way that they imagine, that the way society works of people rising and falling and standing is the same as natural or sexual selection. It doesn't even say that, it says, hey, look, competition is part of biology. Sure. And competition is part of at least a kind of market society. Even statist ones have a kind of competition of corruption. But it doesn't mean it's all the same thing or that one should be modeled on the other. In the case of evolutionary psychology, or its previous incarnation as sociobiology, the idea is a little bit different. There, it's what we sometimes call adaptationism. So adaptationism is, simply put, a misunderstanding of the theory of natural and sexual selection. So just because the processes of natural and sexual selection are there and have an influence in how species evolve over time, it does not mean that every given trait we can identify in a species, every part in their body, every factor that in their behavior, that each of these is selected for. So look, say you have a gene for black hair and that previously you didn't, and in the population, and all of a sudden you start having black hair, and now your predators don't see you at night, whereas when you had white hair, it was really easy to see you, and so you start surviving, right? Okay, that trait was selected for, right? Natural selection had an impact on the distribution of that trait over time. But right next to that gene for black hair was also a gene, let's say, for blue eyes, and the blue eyes made no difference to whether you survived or not, but it kind of had a lucky position, and it got to kind of free ride off the success of that hair gene. That is selected, but it's not selected for. And so the fact that we have, say, blue eyes, an adaptationist would say everything is adaptive. Everything is selected by natural and sexual selection to be advantageous. So they would look at these like blue eyes in this population and they'd make up a story, a just so story, to use the Kipling term, about why it was advantageous to have these. And it'd be completely wrong because sometimes it's just random. Sometimes it's just what's along for the ride. Sometimes it's a mutation, right? And sometimes what looks like a trait from our perspective may not be exactly how it gets causally impacted at the genetic level or at the level of survival or population dynamics. Okay, so what does all this have to do with psychology? Well, evolutionary psychology or sociobiology is a sort of way of explaining human behavior, human psychological, sociological tics in terms of evolutionary factors. And there's just two big problems with this whole approach. One, which traits they pick, whether these even are traits, because it's very easy to sort of take things that are basically just gender biases, right? Like people go, men are like this and women are like that, which are not actually backed up empirically, or maybe they do have a distribution, but it's not necessary. It's free choice. It's the way society conditions you. In a different society, men would not all be thus and women would be so, but they'd be the same or would be reversed or a little bit different. So that's the first thing. The picking of traits is wrong. And then the second thing that's wrong with this is we don't actually know the social context of human beings prior to about 7,000 years ago. We have very limited archaeological, paleontological information, but we don't know what the family structure of human beings 50,000 years ago was. So when an evolutionary psychologist, you're from Cosmides and Tooby to Jordan Peterson, comes along and they say, you know, like, why does the top lobster with the BDE, you know, why is this adaptive, and why is the man who does this good? Well, and then they give you a story like, you know, why do guys just seem to succeed when they go to the club and they pick up women when they've got a good woman at home? And they go, well, because cave guys would go to the cave club and they'd pick up cave women, and the cave guys who picked up cave women smashed more and they had more cave babies. And so as a result, we are the descendants of the cave jerks who cheated on their cave wives. And that's why today jerks cheat on their wives. And this makes no sense. It's just repeating in the past what you think and don't necessarily see is in the present. So it's a just so story. It's just a made up story to explain a trait which we haven't even shown is biologically fixed by reference to conditions that you have no knowledge of and which seem to just reproduce the same gender biases that are already in the culture. So it's junk science. The theory of evolution is excellent science. Evolutionary psychology is barely science at all. It's just, it's humbuggery with a scientific chic.
Yeah, so the sort of point of a lot of this junk science, it seems to me, is to basically show you that selfishness is not rational, or selfishness is not moral. It's not to any positive end, because left to pursue our own values, we're all just cavemen going to the cave club and, you know, having sex outside of our marriage. Whereas if we have religion or something similar to religion, now we'll be able to overcome these evolutionarily determined inclinations we have. Do you agree with that?
I think that's the Jordan Peterson picture. That's the picture that, yes, let's cleave man in two. There's the natural part of man and the supernatural part of man. The natural part of man is a brute. He is not selfish in the rational sense. He's selfish in the whim worshiping sense. He's just sexual urges, and he's just a stomach and a dick. And that's how he would live. But lo and behold, there's something totally from the outside, you know, this code from God. And no, it doesn't make natural sense. No, it doesn't seem advantageous. But if we cleave to it, we can rise above the animal part of us by turning to the angel part of us, right? That's one way to take this. Another way to take it is some people take this as basically saying, yeah, like we are brutes, or we are no better than this, or they'll give evolutionary explanations for errors in human reasoning. They'll say things like, look, our knowledge or our brains didn't evolve to be able to do these high level theories. They just evolved to like figure out if that was a good place to go to get lunch or not. And so we can't expect it to do this or that. Sometimes they go the other way. Like some people do say the senses are reliable because they evolved to be so. But and then further, you also get a large project in philosophy of science, some even in science proper, of trying to explain altruism evolutionarily. So like there are species besides human beings that show what seems like altruistic behavior. It's neither egoistic nor altruistic insofar as these are not species with choice. These aren't moral actions, but where creatures do seem to sacrifice themselves for the group, like meerkats standing up to warn the whole warren, or I forget what their population centers are called, and that the one who stands up to warn them often gets eaten. And then scientists are like, how did that happen? How would that have evolved? And that's actually a genuine puzzle for them. But then they try to explain evolution of altruism. But once you get sometimes to the evolution of altruism, then they go, see, it's evolved. So altruism is ethics after all, which is a weird thing to do, but sometimes that's just where they're going. Like if we can show that it makes some natural sense, then it makes sense again, and it can be ethics again. And none of this, I think, makes meta-ethical sense. None of this is a way to tie, I think, a moral theory to natural or real facts.
Right. Okay. So Ayn Rand's ethics, her objectivist ethics essay, it talks about how each species, each life form pursues certain values, and of course, humans are no exception. And our sort of the form in which we pursue our values is by using our rational faculty. So, to reason and to follow an ethical code does not conflict with our nature. It actually is our nature. Also, the way that Ayn Rand identifies consciousness as axiomatic, I think, or as like identifies consciousness philosophically the way she does, also kind of addresses a lot of this sort of junk science out there. Let's talk about kind of how the theory of evolution affects maybe the way we look at the essence of humans and the problem of universals in philosophy.
Yeah. So So as you were saying, Rand's ethics, Aristotle's ethics, a number of ethical theories, but by no means all, take something to be special about human beings as a kind. It says, as human beings, there are certain things that are true about all of us that are not true about other living creatures. And certain things work or are good for other living creatures because of the way they are. Certain things work or are good for our kind of creatures because we're the kind of creatures that we are. And there's something in common with all of us. Let's say it's reason, or that's the most important thing that's in common with us. And that has certain implications for how we, if we're humans, can live a life which can only successfully be a human life, because I can't successfully live a giraffe kind of life, or a wolf kind of life, or a sheep kind of life. Okay, well, the theory of natural selection, it does show something. It shows that human beings or any other species as a type wasn't necessarily always here, and that our ancestors didn't always look exactly like we look over an enormous period of time. And one thing that might imply for your metaphysics and epistemology is that a certain notion of essence, of real essence, can't quite be right. So it can't quite be that there's this little thing inside each of us, manness, that's exactly identical and makes us have all the generic human properties. Why? Well, there had to be some kind of intermediary form, your so-called missing link, where it wasn't quite modern human yet, but it was on its way. And essences don't really seem like the kind of thing that you can have 80% of, although I might think, why not? But that's part of it. And then the theory of natural selection also only works if you find all over the place variation within a population. So what it suggests is for just about every trait, you see little bits of differences across a population. And when those differences make a difference, that's when you start to have selective pressures. And in general, the way that species form is some populations split off from other populations. Sometimes they reunite later, sometimes not. Sometimes they evolve in parallel, sometimes they diverge. And all of it has been seen as sort of undermining a certain kind of essentialism, a certain kind of picture where there's something identical in all the creatures of a type that makes them that, and so you make conclusions. Now, in the Aristotelian tradition, the dominant sort of way of thinking about human nature is in terms of essences or moderate realism. Not every time, but that's been the case. And there have been, long before the theory of evolution, there were arguments against essentialism that looked at sort of biological accidents. So in the 17th century, Gassendi, Locke, they look at the case of sort of birth defects, what they called monstrosities or terata in Greek. And they go, if you have human nature and human nature just makes you all the same, and you're human, how can you not have reason? How could you not have, it's a stamp, right? You should have all the Platonic things, right? Anyway, so that's been around for a long time, but what the theory of evolution seems to suggest is forget just the borderline cases. There's no there's no single essence. And I think that in a sense, that's true. Now, what I mean is, I don't think there are real essences. I don't think it's the theory of evolution uniquely that shows that. I think, like I was saying, there have been arguments going back hundreds of years that made pretty much the same case about a certain kind of moderate realism, that can't be what's going on physically or metaphysically. But it doesn't mean that the alternative, the extreme alternative of nominalism is true. It doesn't mean that like we just lump these things together and there's no basis. So there are real similarities and differences that allow us to unite together different populations, right? At the end of the day, the theory of evolution still is a theory about different individual organisms that are close enough alike and in close enough proximity to each other that they function as a population together. And we couldn't even say that there was that species if we couldn't conceptualize them together and say, oh, these are all X, those are not X, they're Y. So I don't think that the theory of evolution undercuts a weak kind of essentialism, not metaphysical essentialism, where there's this magic little thing in each of us, but epistemic essentialism. That is where we can discern certain things in common that are similar enough, very, very similar enough compared to other living things, that it only makes sense to try to treat us as equivalent in those respects and to group us together. And on the basis of that, certain things follow. Just to kind of conclude this last point, like nobody would look at two different people and say, look, there's natural variation. Your legs are long, my legs are short, your gait is fast, mine is slow. The recommendations we make for walking are totally different for you two. That's crazy, right? We basically walk the same way as against crawling. Well, the same thing would be true, like, yes, you're a little better at math. I have a little bit better long-term memory. Your first language is Spanish, mine was English. It's not true that you can survive on instinct, but I can survive only by making plans. We both can survive by reason and not instinct.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we got a few minutes to power through some of these super chats. As often is the case, we got more to talk about than God gave us time for. Shazbot, welcome. He's become a member.
Thanks.
The analytic synthetic dichotomy sent us a question about the dim hypothesis, so maybe we'll get to that in a minute if we have time. Obviously, the author of that book is not here to answer it. Marilyn with $5 says, where does induction come in? I struggle to understand the difference between deduction and induction.
That's a great question, and maybe we can devote a whole segment to that, if not an episode, at least a segment on different processes of inference. But the simple thing is that the simplest way to do it is induction reaches new generalizations you previously didn't have, and generally it reaches them from lower level or more narrow generalizations, or from looking at particular cases, and then says, oh, this is that. I guess they're all that, or why. Or it's a process of forming a new concept from previous things that you saw but hadn't conceptualized that way. Whereas deduction tends to take a generalization you already have and apply it to some other related category or to particular cases. So I know this is true about all triangles, so it's going to be true of this triangle, say. So one is from generalizations down, and the other is from particulars or lower generalizations up to higher generalizations.
Enric asks, how does evolution relate to an animal-like human beings that creates its environment and evolves it across time? I love you, Enric, but how many, the better question is, how many misspellings and, typos can you fit into one super chat? But we love this super chat, though. My favorite of the day.
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a nice discussion at one point by Rand. Which essay is it? I forgot. I'll come back next time with an answer to that, where she talks about various ways that in different sciences they've used sort of non-essentials to categorize humankind. So you might think like man is the creature that uses tools. Man is the primate with opposable thumbs, right? But man is the talking creature. And any of these that don't organize by essentials, by the rational animal, suffer from several defects. So first off, it doesn't explain the full range of things that are true about man, where being rational doesn't explain everything about us. In other words, rational spiders from Mars would have chitin where we have bone, let's say, and rationality wouldn't explain that, being a chordate would, but it would explain the most number of things about our behavior, how we survive, how we do all that. And all these other things, like we use tools, are really only a narrower application of reason. But also, it's the case that we may find other species that have limited, very limited tool use. So various other apes that may use sort of straw to kind of get ants out of an anthill, or that may stack up a block to climb up higher. Yes, we do find some limited amount of tool use. Do they create novel types of tools that combine multiple different objects together and bind them together? No. Do they invent in this way and refine these things over time? No. Do they pretty much like just pick up something in the immediate environment and immediately put it into application? Yeah, that's what we find in limited degree. So if you just said, well, we're a tool creature, suddenly man wouldn't look special. But when you think about it is, how do we use tools? In what way? And why is it so much more than other creatures? Because of reason, suddenly you get a kind of perspective where you understand what's special about man, at least special relative to all the other living things alive on Earth now. It may be in the universe, there are other, maybe even lots of other rational beings given infinite time. I would suspect there at least have been and will be rational species an infinite number of times before. Whether we'll ever meet them or not, I don't know. But there you go.
All right, Marilyn super chat saying, I am too special. I think you mean I too am special. Thank you.
Yes, you are.
Bonnie, thank you for the 99 cents. And Justin asks, can you talk about Red Pill's view of evolution? Is Red Pill the name of a particular YouTuber, or do you mean the general Red Pilled view of evolution? Because that might fall under the category of some of the faulty understandings of evolution discussed earlier. I'm guessing you don't really understand who he's asking about.
Yeah. Is that supposed to be like Peterson or one of his acolytes?
The red-pilled people, they tend to be kind of overlap with the pickup artists, kind of like, the a-hole who sleeps with a bunch of women is sort of winning evolutionarily.
Yeah. So that's just more bullshit evolutionary psychology, pardon my French, right? So like in no sense, so first off, it's not even clear that some pickup artist who goes home with a different person every night of the week is actually more likely to have lots of children. And not that having a larger number of children, replacing your genes, is actually the human goal. So one aspect of scientism I didn't mention before, but you could, is the kind of gene's eye view. This is some of the worst work, I think, of Dawkins, like the selfish gene, where the idea is we're just robots driven around by genes that are trying to replicate genes. And if that's true, then the goal of certain chains of nucleotides is to reproduce those chains of nucleotides. Okay, well, it's not even true that just being a hookup artist is necessarily going to get that to happen. You're much more likely to have, if you have polygamy and you're the king of Egypt or you're Genghis Khan and you have 20 wives and you rule for 50 years, yes, you'll have an enormous number of children. But if, like most human beings, you're in pair bonding, right? Pair bonding works a heck of a lot better for producing a large number of children, if you want them, than just trying to one-offs with strangers. That's not a great way to do it. But forget that it's not a great way to do it. Who the hell said it's a good thing to be done in the first place? Or another way to put it is, okay, a sexual process, look, all of us got here through a sexual process, and our species got the way we got through natural and sexual pressures and random mutation and genetic drift. That doesn't mean that continuing to behave in the way that works for that process is how we should behave, right? Just because, look, your parents may have moved to a neighborhood because when they moved there, it was good economic opportunity. Does that mean you should stay there? Does that mean you should stay there after the factory closes down, or you should stay there when the job you want is the kind of thing you can only do in the city? No. So why would you think that just because you're more likely to have shown up with a trait now, it means that you should exemplify that trait, or even that you would?
Okay, we are out of time. We'll get to the dim hypothesis another day, although of course it'll be a very qualified answer if we're able to address it. But yeah, well, thank you for sending it in. We'll save it for the future. Coming up at 7 p.m. UK time in just a few minutes, it's Finance Friday with Jim Brown on, quote, is it a recession or a banana? That reminds me of how Ali G proved evolution when he was talking to a creationist. He asked him, has you ever eaten a banana? There you go. That is proof. All right, then at 8 p.m. UK time, it's James Valiant, Robert Nasser, and Amy Nasser continuing their discussion on Leonard Peikoff's Keeping It Real. Today's topic, how does one lead an atheist life in a mystical society? Part 2. Thank you for joining us. What's that? Fabulously, absolutely. Thank you for joining us today. It's a cool little new setup we've got going on here. I think I was getting most of the light, so we'll have to move things around a bit, although you look cool, like in tans without getting most of the light. So, you know, who do you guys like better? Be honest. Leave us a comment down below. Thank you all for joining us today.
Neither of us is going to be happy with what we get.
True. All right. And goodbye.